Several viewers contacted me. They said, Sajid, you are just sharing news on daily basis about Tigray conflict, but you are not analyzing this conflict, especially the mediation. What is the future of this mediation led by African Union and other partners? Is there any chance of the success of this mediation? Are the parties sincere in finding a political solution to this conflict? And what about mediators? Can they play a constructive role? Are they impartial? So I thought of making a video on my understanding of the mediation efforts. To understand the mediation efforts to resolve Tigray conflict, we'll have to start from November 2020, when this war broke out, 3rd of November 2020. What happened in November? In November, African Union nominated 3 former presidents from Mozambique and from 2 other countries to mediate, to put an end to this war. In November, when Ethiopian government forces were making gains and Tigray forces were suffering losses, what happened in this first attempt to mediate? Ethiopian federal government outrightly rejected the first mediation attempt. And though the 3 envoys traveled to Ethiopia, if I am not wrong, but they were not allowed to play any constructive role to resolve this conflict politically through dialogue. Why is that the first attempt failed? It failed because back then Ethiopian government was in a commanding position. Ethiopian government forces were capturing cities. Tigray was on the back foot, so that is why Ethiopian government rejected mediation. And then from November 2020 till June 2021, there were no significant mediation efforts, especially from African Union. Though Jeffrey Feltman was appointed as US Special Envoy at the start of 2021, he traveled to Ethiopia as well. But we did not see any major progress. And from November 2020 till June 2021, Ethiopian government forces were in control of the situation. Tigray forces were trying to defend their territories. They had to retreat from all the major towns. They were fighting in Tam in mountains. And Ethiopian government did not want to lose what they had gained in the battlefield. What happened after June? Because at the end of June 2021, Ethiopian government forces, Eritrean forces, they withdrew from most parts of Tigray. And in August 2021, Obasanjo was appointed as African Union's High Representative for the Horn of Africa. And in August, if you remember, Tigray forces had launched offensive on neighboring Amhara far regions. And Tigray forces were making gains. So in August, when African Union made the second attempt to mediate, back then Tigray was in a better position militarily because Tigray forces were in Amhara far regions and they were hoping to remove Addis Ababa government. So Tigray government did not take Obasanjo's appointment seriously. Why? Because Tigray had some other plans. Then came modern combat drones. I think in November, around November, Ethiopian government deployed modern combat drones, Turkish TB2s, wing long one stones, which changed the battlefield picture. Before that, if you remember, Sadkan is on record, TDF general. He said there was no force between Tigray Defense Force and Addis Ababa, and there was no one to talk to. Getachew also said that there was no one to talk to. Why? Because Tigray thought it was in a position to remove Addis Ababa government by force. So Tigray was not interested in mediation back then. You see that whenever in this conflict a party was in a strong position, it was not interested in mediation. But after the introduction of the deployment of combat drones, battlefield balance tipped in favor of Ethiopian government. Tigray forces started suffering losses in November, and they started their retreat from Amhara, Afar region. They were close to Debre Birhan, and they had to retreat. They suffered losses, and they were back in Tigray. So, the retreat of Tigray Defense Force meant that back in November, December last year, Ethiopian government forces secured a military leverage. And since November, December till today, Ethiopian government forces have been maintaining this military leverage. Tigray withdrew from Amhara Afar regions, and then in March this year, humanitarian truce was announced by Ethiopian federal government, and Tigray regional government agreed. Ethiopian federal government forces did not enter Tigray after the retreat of Tigray forces from Amhara Afar regions. So from March this year, a new phase of this conflict started. Tigray started feeling the pinch of the siege, which it has been since the start of this conflict. People ran out of food. Basic services were already suspended, banking, telecom, electricity. It became difficult for Tigray to continue military campaign. That is how I see it, that this year, at the start of this year, siege started having its impact on the people of Tigray. So that is why Tigray stepped back from some of its preconditions, some of its conditions for engagement, and mediation came into play. So we can say that mediation came into play just a few months ago. And it came into the picture because Ethiopian government secured military leverage. Tigray was pushed back into its territories, and Tigray was not in a position to challenge Ethiopian government forces once again. So that is why Tigray agreed to mediation as well. Ethiopian government, though in a commanding position, has agreed to mediation too. But at the same time, one point, very important point, which people ignore sometimes, is that Ethiopian government will never lose the leverage which it secured last year in the battlefield. When Tigray says that all its preconditions be met before the start of talks, it means that if it happens, if all preconditions are met, Ethiopian federal forces, Ethiopian federal government, they'll lose their leverage, what they gained in the battlefield last year. If preconditions like withdrawal of all forces from Tigray, lifting of siege on Tigray, restoration of all services in Tigray, if all that happens before the start of talks, it means that Ethiopian government will lose the leverage which it gained last year. Ethiopian government wants to enter these talks with the military leverage which they secured last year in the battlefield. Tigray is hoping that all these preconditions will be met before the start of talks, which do not seem likely. Mediation has a limited role in this conflict. The two parties have stated their preconditions. Tigray, as I said earlier, what they want. And Ridwan Hussein, Ethiopian National Security Advisor, last week spoke about Ethiopian government's preconditions as well. What is Ethiopian government's precondition before start of talks? Ethiopian government says there must be enabling environment for resumption of basic services in Tigray. There is no likelihood of lifting of siege or withdrawal of forces from Tigray. Even resumption of basic services will also require creation of some enabling environment, according to Ethiopian government. It means that government is very clear. It does not want to give all what Tigray wants before the start of talks. It wants to sit with Tigray representatives and then gradually things could improve. So this point must not be ignored. Secondly, mediators. Tigray mistrusts Obasanjo because there was no African Union between November 2020 and June 2021 when Ethiopian government forces were making gains in Tigray. African Union did not seriously try to mediate back then. Just three nominations Ethiopian government rejected and African Union became silent. But suddenly when Tigray started making gains militarily in after June 2021, African Union became active. Obasanjo was appointed as the mediator. So that is why Tigray mistrusts African Union and Obasanjo. On the other hand, Ethiopian federal government mistrusts EU, UN, US. Ethiopian government is of this position that these players want to resuscitate a Tigray government. Last week, Ridwan Hussein, in a statement, lashed out at foreign envoys who traveled to Tigray, and after that, they called for resumption of basic services. So it means that both the parties mistrust mediators. Who is mediator? Another question. Will African Union lead these talks or will EU, US, UN join African Union? It seems that no one body can lead this process. As I said earlier, Tigray mistrusts African Union, Ethiopian government mistrusts EU, US, UN. It means there are going to be more than one mediators. And it is being heard that perhaps African Union, EU, US, UN, they'll join hands, they'll jointly mediate this conflict. Can this joint mediation work? Another question. So what I want to say is that this mediation in itself is not so powerful that it can put pressure upon the two parties. The two parties have their own plans. They cannot be influenced by the mediators. Mediators have a very limited role. Though Ethiopian government is definitely in need of financial aid, economic conditions are alarming, economy is in shambles in Ethiopia. So government is in need of funds, in need of grants, loans from financial institutions, and lately we have seen World Bank giving grants to Ethiopian government. Sort of carrot and stick policies underway. Two bills, HR 6600, S3199 are pending at US House and Senate which call for sanctions on Ethiopian government. So, carrot and stick policy adopted by the US and the EU as well against Ethiopian federal government. Having said all this, mediation has a limited role because the two parties have their own agendas which cannot be considerably influenced. Can this mediation succeed? In the next video, we'll try to analyze the success, future success of this mediation. So far, I personally think the role of mediators is limited. Thank you for watching.